How is duality constructed? Suppose we accept that there is such a thing as a universal consciousness, that we are all part of the same whole, something like Brahman, as I discussed on the video on the screen. Well, then, how does duality appear? Why does everyday reality seem so different from that? Why are we so convinced, intellectually and experientially, that we are separate beings, different from one another and from the world around us? In this video, we're going to explore the foundation of duality. How is the world you see constructed in your mind? And if you have a mind, even if you are a fish, you are constantly building the world. How does that happen? It turns out that all of reality as we experience it is built on a triad, three concepts that may seem separate but actually need each other to exist. These three concepts are duality, perception, and differentiation. In this video, I'll show you that perception cannot be separated from duality. What I mean here is that the act of perceiving anything at all necessarily creates duality. There is no separation between the two things. If you are an animal that perceives, you must perceive in a dualistic way. So, to be clear about my claim, perception is the source of all duality. This means that to see the oneness of all, one must transcend perception itself. This is an abstract discussion, but it is useful. We live in a dual world. All of our experience of existence is separate. You and I are separate. What I will show is that there is no way to perceive anything that is not through separation. What you think you are, a human, is a perceiving machine that perceives as humans do. A human is an interface with reality. Your body and your mind are means of perception. Their very nature is separating. To be human is to be separate. To not be separate, to realize oneness, we have to transcend our humanity. I'll first show you that duality, perception, and separation are not hierarchical. They all depend on each other. Then I'll explain how these three concepts, duality, perception, and differentiation, form the foundation of everything you perceive. At first glance, duality, perception, and differentiation may not seem directly related, but as we'll see, they're actually deeply interconnected. So, what is duality? Duality is the experience of contrast. For example, I know you and I aren't the same thing because in some way I define myself as not you. Duality is the idea that anything in this world isn't something else. I'm not you, maybe because we're in different places or maybe because my body has borders, who knows. One thing I'm sure of is that your left eyebrow is definitely not a part of me. It's the same with the chair I'm sitting on. I know I'm not the chair because I define the chair as having a border, taking up space, while I take up a different space. So we're distinct. There is the chair and there is me. We're not the same thing. So the key idea is this, not that. Duality is the structure that makes differentiation possible. In my view, the simplest definition of duality is that it's the perception of different things. In more esoteric terms, if we are to use the Advaita Vedanta's language, duality is the Brahman appearing as many. Now, here you can see the issue. To define duality, we've used the word perception and the word different. Duality is the perception of different things. But even when I use different words to define it, you'll see that the ideas of perception and differentiation are still there. For example, if I say duality is the Brahman appearing as many, what does that mean? Well, it means that there is such a thing as to appear, which means something is being perceived. And if it appears as many, that means the Brahman is being perceived as more than one thing. Well, for there to be more than one, there must be different things. Now, the simplest, not the best, but the simplest way to define duality is not one. Duality is not one. But this definition requires us to understand the concept of not and the concept of one. The word not is literally the concept that differentiates. So duality is not one. This means duality is not something. Duality is defined by differentiation from something. And that something is one. Duality is not one. What about the idea of one? One is a thing. It has to exist for us to use it in the definition of duality. But for one to exist, it has to be known, and to be known, it has to be perceived. One is just a word until you understand it as defining something in the world. There must be something, literally something that exists, and that means there must be something that is perceived. I know this is a bit abstract. It is the same as in my videos about Advaita Vedanta and dhyana. At this level, when we're talking about the most fundamental conception of reality, words start to fail us. Here's what I can tell you. Gottlob Frege, back in 1884, showed that numbers, including 1, aren't objects, but concepts. And these concepts are recognized through differentiation. You'll notice the word recognize there is tied to perception, and differentiation, that's tied to, well, differentiation. So, Frege's exploitation into the concept of 1 requires the ideas of perception and differentiation. Now, Frege is one of the founders of modern logic and analytic philosophy. His work laid the foundation for a lot of what we think about in contemporary mathematical logic, philosophy of language, and the philosophy of mathematics. So, his idea of 1 is actually at the base of all science. Then, Bertrand Russell, one of the most influential logicians of the 20th century, took these ideas even further in his work Principia Mathematica from 1910. It's a monumental piece of work that aimed to ground all of mathematics in formal logic. What Russell demonstrated was that 1 doesn't exist as an independent thing. Instead, it's a relational property. It's something that we recognize as separate from other things. And there's the word recognized again, tied to perception, and separate, which is tied to differentiation. Studies in cognitive psychology actually show that babies and animals don't perceive 1 the way adults do. They perceive contrast before they even understand the concept of numbers. The brain perceives and differentiates before it even knows what 1 is. So, all of this is to say that defining duality as not 1 may be the simplest way to put it, but just like every other definition we've talked about, it relies on the 2 other concepts of perception and differentiation. This means that duality as a concept is not a thing unless one can perceive and differentiate. There is no duality without perception and differentiation. But that may give you the impression that perception and differentiation come before duality. So it might make you believe that there is a property of perception and a property of differentiation and that they come before duality. But that's not true. I will show you that duality is actually not separate from perception and differentiation. The 3 concepts are co-emerging. So let's turn to the second concept, perception. Perception is the process by which sensory information is interpreted and understood by the brain. But perception isn't just passively receiving information. It's actually an active process of differentiating and cataloging what we experience. Without differentiation, we wouldn't be able to perceive anything. That's because perception relies on contrast. You can't really perceive something unless it stands out as different from something else. And without duality, we wouldn't be able to perceive either, because perception needs a difference between this and that. There has to be more than one thing. Otherwise, perception would just collapse into a single undivided experience, which really wouldn't be an experience at all. In fact, those who have reached the maximum levels of enlightenment report precisely that the experience of oneness or emptiness, however it is defined, is not really an experience. If we are going to be precise, one cannot experience non-duality. Experiencing anything at all requires perception and differentiation. So the act of experiencing belongs to the realm of duality. This isn't just some abstract idea. Philosophy and modern cognitive science both confirm that perception is closely tied to differentiation. Plato and Aristotle argued that perception isn't just a sensation, but the recognition of contrast. And contrast means recognizing 2 things, which is duality, and recognizing them as separate, which is differentiation. Kant went even further and showed that perception is structured by the mind into clear distinctions. For something to be perceived, it needs to appear against the backdrop of something else. There has to be a thing and a background. So, the thing and the background are 2 separate things, that's duality, and they need to be different in some way, that's differentiation. Modern neuroscience confirms this. We don't just perceive objects passively. We actually perceive by first detecting contrast. Without differentiation, perception wouldn't even exist. And without duality, the recognition of more than one thing, there'd be nothing to differentiate. So, perception cannot exist without duality and differentiation. You see what's happening here? Duality cannot exist without perception and differentiation, and perception cannot exist without duality and differentiation. Now, let me show you that differentiation cannot exist without duality and perception. The concept of differentiation is simply the recognition that one thing is not another. That's it. If I say this is a table and that is a chair, I have just differentiated. I've performed an act of differentiation. I have recognized two things as distinct. You may try to define differentiation in other ways, but here's the thing. You still need the other two concepts to do that, duality and perception. To differentiate requires more than one thing, that is duality. And to differentiate, you need to perceive. Something has to be perceived as not being one with something else. So, the three concepts, duality, perception, and differentiation, are not hierarchical. For one to exist, you need the other two. The idea is that to create duality, you need perception and differentiation first. To perceive, you need duality and differentiation first. To differentiate, you need duality and perception first. So it seems that we cannot have any of these concepts emerge before the other two. They must co-emerge. There is no hierarchy between duality, perception, and differentiation. All three are interconnected, so duality has to emerge together with perception and differentiation. Please stay with me on this. The point I'm making is that perception itself is duality. It doesn't come before perception, and it doesn't come after perception. Duality is born when perception is born, specifically when perception of difference is born. We like to think of duality as an abstract religious concept and perception as a more mundane concept. We talk about the way we perceive things and changing our perception, these kinds of things. But this mundane thing, perception, is the root of the illusion of separation. Many mystical traditions say that God divided itself so it could experience itself. You've probably seen this idea before, right? This appears in Tantra, Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, Sufism, and Hermeticism. The idea is that God, whatever God is believed to be, divides in order to experience itself. Can you see the ideas there of God dividing itself in some way, that is differentiation, because it wants to experience, that is, it wants to perceive? You see, if God wanted to experience itself, it needed to divide itself in some way, and it does so through perception. Perceiving is separating. Weirdly, God's enjoyment is the source of all of our suffering. Now, I don't want to go into the religious conceptions of duality in this video. Even the notion of a God that wanted something is a delicate one. I personified God here, saying that He wanted to experience itself. And although many traditions say that, in fact, quite literally, the idea of God creating duality to experience itself is a lot more complex than I can tackle here and does not necessarily imply a desire. I just want to point out that perception is not a result of duality. It is duality. Perceiving things is how duality is created. It's perception itself that creates the illusion of separation. Perception is Maya, Lila, Namarupa, the dust, Klipat, Kinoma, the veil of matter, the veil of flesh, the shadow of God, Aye, or Ginem. It's whatever the many spiritual traditions have called the great illusion that deceives us into thinking we are separate from the divine. So, duality is created through our perception organs and our minds. We see duality, we hear it, smell it, taste it, and feel it. We think duality. Your mind is like a duality creating machine. Your eyes, ears, and skin are constantly receiving input, but the separation, the distinction between this and that, isn't something that is in the raw data. It's something the mind creates. Your mind is a machine that differentiates things from the chaos of the whole. So, what is a human? A human is a perception machine. What is a bat? A bat is also a perception machine. So is a tree. Any being that can perceive is creating its own version of perception. Now, what is a human again? A human is the universal consciousness perceiving the world as a human perceives. The human creates a dual world where a certain part of the light spectrum can be seen, a certain part of the sound spectrum can be heard, and certain sensations can be felt. We can feel the wind, we can feel the heat of the sun, but we don't feel, say, a germ entering us. A bat, on the other hand, creates a completely different dual manifestation. It perceives a different part of the light spectrum, a completely different part of the sound spectrum, and in fact, it perceives it all in a completely different way than we do. Bats construct their spatial reality using a totally different medium than we do. We use vision, bats use echolocation, so their world ends up seeming very different from ours. In fact, echolocation is a great example of this because it shows that our reality isn't just passively perceived, it's actually created. Let's look at this. Some humans have developed echolocation abilities. Quite a few blind people develop the skill of echolocation by making clicking sounds and listening to the echoes that come back. Brain scans of these humans show that their visual cortex lights up when they use echolocation, meaning they're in a real sense seeing with sound. And in fact, it seems like they actually see pretty vivid images. Why does this matter for this discussion? Because a human is a perception machine that perceives the world in the way humans do. Humans who have been deprived of one of their sensory organs and developed sensory capacity with other organs end up perceiving very similarly to typical humans. Now, take a bat. When it echolocates, it stimulates its auditory cortex. But when a human echolocates, it's the visual cortex that gets activated. So the human is creating a human-like reality, where space is perceived as images produced by the visual cortex, while the bat creates a completely different reality with their auditory cortex, one that we can't really understand. We don't actually understand the reality of a bat. Now, it's really important to clarify something here. Just because something can perceive does not mean it is aware. This is where a lot of the discussions about consciousness can get confusing. Perception and awareness are actually two different things. I talked about this in my video on neti, linked on the screen, where we eliminate perception and yet awareness remains. For example, a plant can certainly perceive. Plants can pick up on things like humidity, gravity, heat, touch, chemicals, and even sound, but that doesn't mean the plant is aware. In fact, we don't know if plants are aware or not. There's actually a lot of debate on this, both in science and among different religious traditions. What I'm trying to get at is that awareness and perception are not the same thing. The point I'm making in this video is that perception is what creates duality, not awareness. In fact, awareness is fundamentally non-dual. What I mean here is that the realization that you are pure awareness is the realization of non-duality. So we could say that pure awareness is non-duality and perception is duality. They're two different things, as different as the fundamental difference in the nature of reality, the difference between non-duality and duality. Now, I know some of you might be wondering, what do I mean when I say humans are perception machines? Didn't humans evolve like every other animal on this planet? Well, yes, evolution is inherent to humans. It's also inherent to bats and to every other live being on this planet. Humans may not have evolved physically in the way we think about it. That's an interesting topic to consider. But evolution is certainly the best model we have to explain how all live beings are connected. So, evolution is tied to perception. It cannot come before it. Humans are that which perceives as humans do, and we perceive ourselves to be related to other live beings on this planet through evolution. Evolution is the best framework we have for understanding how different life forms relate to each other, but we also need to recognize that evolution as an idea is built on the concept of time. And time, well, time is dual. It's something created by perception. So evolution cannot be any more real than time itself. I'm not saying evolution is not real. I'm saying that there are layers of reality, and evolution cannot belong to a layer that is higher than time. If this feels a little abstract, I invite you to check out my neti video where I dive deeper into how different layers of reality can exist. For now, let's leave it at this. Evolution is true in terms of our practical experience. Nothing we've discussed here contradicts it. These philosophical, religious, and esoteric ideas don't deny evolution, they just offer a different perspective on what it means. If you want me to dive deeper into how evolution fits or doesn't within a fundamentally non-dual reality, let me know in the comments. Returning to our point, the experience of being a human is the experience of perceiving as a human perceives. This means that being human is to generate duality through the perception tools a human has. You may think there is duality, and then within duality, our body and mind emerge. No, this is not how this goes. There is no duality, and then within duality, your body and mind appear. As far as your experience of being alive is, your body and mind literally create duality. That is, to be a human is to create duality as a human does, and to be a cat is to create duality as a cat does. To transcend duality, one must not be human anymore. It is not possible to be human and not perceive, and it is not possible to perceive without creating duality. This means that to achieve self-realization, to realize non-duality, we must transcend our humanity. I don't mean that you need to die or leave your body in some sense, but you must somehow transcend the perception of a human. In fact, you must transcend perception altogether. And when you transcend the perception of a human, you are fundamentally no longer human. Okay, I'll leave this discussion here for now. If you like this type of deep exploration into the nature of reality, like, subscribe, and share our content. Your support is our fuel. Watch out for a future video on why we perceive ourselves to be separate, the mechanics of how we cannot see our connection. I'll link it here when I make it. I wish you all the best in this path, and I hope to see you soon in my next video.